The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, guys, I'm going to spend a little time today talking about the Run Formula Calculator, which I call not your average calculator, and just kind of explaining the inputs and how best to use it to maximize its capabilities for you when you're trying to figure out, hey, what can I run in this race that I've been training for? Just as a way of introduction, I am Beth Peterson, actually. Beth Shutt was my former name. I just got married, and I am the Run Formula Operations Director. Okay, so first of all, I'll briefly speak through the actual inputs for the calculator and kind of the data that you'll need to know. Basically, what makes the Run Formula Calculator not the average calculator. And then we'll just go through and run through the calculator itself and do a couple examples. So first of all, most run calculators or performance predictor calculators, essentially what you do is you enter a time that you've run in another race, and then it spits out a time that you think you can run. It thinks you can run at a different distance, which is pretty cool, fun to play around with. But there's obviously a lot of factors involved in how fast you can run a marathon or a half marathon or whatever distance, and what you can do at different distances isn't the only factor. So that's essentially why the Run Formula Calculator is pretty special. It's pretty cool, and over many years of coaching, we found it to be extremely accurate, is because it takes into account several other factors. Basically, what are those inputs or factors? We'll talk through a little of each, but basically a 5K run time, which we'll talk in more detail, but essentially that is indicative of what are your training paces, or what have your training paces been for this particular race. Training volumes are big. So not only what are your training paces throughout this training cycle for this A race that you're talking about, but also what, has been your run mileage. If you've also been biking, what has been your bike mileage? How many years have you been doing this? So how many years have you been training at this type of level? Obviously, what is the race distance you're training for, and what does the race course look like? Is it a super hilly, Big Sur marathon, or is it a super flat, fast Berlin marathon, that type of thing? Okay, so first let's talk a little bit about the performance inputs, and a lot of this will make sense once you see the calculator. If you're just listening to this and you're like, what is she even talking about? When you see the calculator, this will make sense. So basically, the calculator asks you for a 5K run time. This actually isn't really an actual 5K run time. It's a time that we'll play around with a little bit so that the output then reflects your training paces. So basically, we might put in a 5K run time of 25 minutes, and that then translates to certain training paces, of which we'll discuss. And we want to make sure that that's actually where you've been training. In order to do that, or in order to kind of take a look at those training paces and make sure that the calculator thinks you've been training at these, you've actually been training where the calculator thinks you have been, we look at it, and when I say we, I mean the Run Formula, all of our athletes, QT2, Outrival, for example, we look at it by way of heart rate zones, because we do heart rate training, essentially. So just to give you an idea, if you do any sort of heart rate training, this is basically how we define our zones. If you're one of our athletes, you know exactly what Z1 is, you know what Z2 is, you know what Z3 is. If you do heart rate, but not necessarily via us, and this is basically how we define our zones, because everybody defines zones a bit differently. So for example, threshold heart rate, which is essentially, you could define threshold heart rate as roughly 5 beats above what you could average for a marathon. So we're taking percentages of those, and that's how we're defining our zones. What that means is ZR is basically a recovery zone, so how you run your super easy recovery runs. Z1 is our aerobic zone, where we do the majority of our work, long runs, the majority of our aerobic type running. Z2 is a tempo type effort. Z3 is sub-threshold. It's pretty tough work. If you're looking at this and you're like, you know what, I don't use heart rate at all. I've never used it. And instead you use more of effort or perceived exertion, you can look at the zones in that sense as well. So Z1, again, Z1 and Z2 is what we're primarily going to be looking at with the run calculator. It is, Z1 is conversational pace. So you're running along, you're doing your long run, you're chit-chatting the whole time, you're not out of breath at all. On a scale of 1 to 10, you're a 4 to a 6.5. Z2 is more like, okay, now I'm running a little bit harder. I can talk in phrases, but I can't, do full-on sentences. My effort level is more of a 6.5 to an 8. Again, if you're not used to heart rate training, this is kind of what we're looking for. What are your training paces in that Z1, Z2 range? I will say that most people that come to us, most runners that come to us, not having done heart rate training before, their definition of aerobic pace or, that long run type pace usually lands in our Z2 range. And all this, why I'm making a big deal of this will all make sense in a little bit when we actually look at the calculator, but you kind of, for the calculator to do its job, you sort of need to know your training paces roughly and kind of what zone you are for those different training paces. And again, if you're one of our athletes, this is very well defined. You know what Z1, Z2, Z3, and ZR are. Okay, so that's a big input, is basically 5K time that translates to what have your training paces been. Next up in terms of input for the calculator is run training mileage. It will ask you, okay, how much mileage have you been doing? Because there's a big difference between somebody that's been running 15 miles a week in training for a marathon and somebody that's been running 60 miles a week in training for a marathon. There's a big durability difference in those two different athletes. Not that they can't be both successful, but in terms of how well are they going to be able to maintain a certain pace and heart rate over 26.2 miles, those are two different animals or two different athletes. So when it asks you run training mileage, it's really asking for the average of your 6 highest training weeks during the previous 10 weeks leading up to the race being estimated. So for example, if you're running a marathon, it's going to ask you in the previous 10 weeks, how much have you been running average? You can take out the recovery weeks, take out the low weeks, take out taper. What are your 6 biggest weeks during that 10-week period prior to the race? And what is that average mileage? So if you ran one 60-mile week, you're not putting 60 in the run training mileage. You're averaging out those, and that makes a big difference for a lot of people. Maybe somebody did a high of 60 miles for 1 week, but in general, their average was around 50, which would, make more sense. So same thing, it'll ask you bike training mileage. And for a lot of pure runners, this is a 0. They're not also riding bikes, but for triathletes who are maybe running an open marathon and they have still been maintaining some type of bike training mileage, that will play to your aerobic fitness and will be a factor in how fast you can run your marathon. But it's the same thing as the run mileage. It's the average of your 6 highest training weeks during the previous 10 weeks leading up to the race being estimated. And then finally, it's going to ask you your years of experience. Basically, this is determined by the number of seasons in which you have raced at the distance being estimated, not including this current year that you're training. So if you are a first-time marathoner, your answer here is 0, and you're doing this for a marathon. if you ran 5 or 6 years in high school and in college, and then you didn't run for, 10 years, and now you're training for your first half marathon, your answer is 0. If you've been doing marathon after marathon after marathon for 5 years in a row, then your answer is 5. People often overestimate this. So I'm just warning you against overestimating. You actually want to just give the number of years you've been training for this type of race, essentially. And then finally, we have some race inputs. So we need to know the race distance. That's fairly self-explanatory. How far is the race that you're wanting to use the calculator for? And then the other big factor is race course ascent. So that's essentially saying how much climbing on the race course is there, because your ability to run, let's say, a 3-hour and 30-minute marathon on an extremely flat course is very different than, the fitness needed to run 3 hours and 30 minutes on an extremely hilly course. So the calculator is asking you, what kind of course are you going to run this on? This is expressed as feet per mile. So basically, didn't know where sorry about that. My cursor disappeared there for a second. So this is based as feet per mile. So what you need to know is how many feet of climbing are there on the course that I'm going to race on? Where do you find that number? Essentially, if you're looking for marathons, there's a bunch of different websites out there. This is just one example of one that I gave. It's basically mymarathonpace.com. It has elevation charts for a bunch of different races, as you can see. If you look on Strava, you can generally find race courses and how many feet of climbing there is. Map My Run is another one. If it's a race that people have done before, obviously, you'll be able to see courses and how much elevation gain. A lot of times on the website for the race itself, the course might tell you total elevation gain. So this is basically the number you're looking for here. So the Bay State Marathon in Massachusetts here, it has 526 feet of total elevation gain. This is the number that you're looking for. You then take that number and divide it, make sure it's in feet. So if it's a European race, they might list it in meters or something like that. So you have a little bit of conversion to do. But you take that number and divide it by the number of miles in the race, and then you'll have feet per mile. And that will give the calculator what it needs to know in terms of how hilly is this race? Is there a lot of climbing? Is it flat? That type of thing. And bonus points to anybody who can name which marathon this is down here. I've put the course elevation for you. Which marathon that is. I'll just tell you it's Boston. Okay, so let's actually go to the calculator. Sorry there. Let's actually go to the calculator and play around with the numbers, and let me show you what I've been talking about here. Okay, so this is what the calculator looks like. It just lives on the Run Formula website. So it's just therunformula.com, and then you go down here to calculators and to running calculator. And here's all the inputs that we were just talking about. So let's just use an example of a marathon. We will look and see, let's use the example of, we're gonna run the Bay State Marathon. It has 526 feet of total elevation gain. So the custom distance is 26.2 miles. It has 526 feet. See here. Let me just do a little bit of calculation. 526 feet divided by 26.2 miles. So that's 20 feet per mile. which is, not flat, and it's also not hilly. It's somewhere in between. Run training mileage. Okay, what is the average of the last 10 total weeks? What is the average of the 6 highest weeks, volume weeks that you've had? Let's just say you got in a really good training cycle. You really had a lot of miles put in, and you ran 50 miles a week. You averaged 50 miles a week for your 6 biggest weeks. I didn't ride my bike at all, so that's a 0. And I've done the last 3 years, including this year, I've done marathons, so I'm going to put a 2 in there because I'm not counting this year. Okay, so this 5K run time, this is the part, this is basically the number that you play around with to produce the training paces that you've been training at. So I'm just going to put in here, I'm going to guess, I could run a 5K in about 20 minutes. You put it in as a function of minute, and second, like this format right here. And then let's hit calculate, and then we'll see if we need to adjust anything. So first thing I do whenever I hit calculate is I go straight to the run training paces, because I want to check, did I put in a proper 5K time to actually produce the training paces that I've been training at? So the calculator is essentially saying, you've been training at roughly, for your zone 1, and again, our athletes, they know what zone 1 is. If you're not one of our athletes, but you use heart rate, zone 1 is about 80 to 86% of your threshold heart rate. If you don't use heart rate at all, zone 1 would be an easy aerobic pace. Chances are, if you're using perceived exertion, you're more in the zone 2 for us. So you want to look at, okay, what do I do my long runs at? You're probably looking at zone 2, more likely. And so essentially now you just want to check, is this where my paces line up? When I'm running zone 1, am I roughly, 8:20 pace, somewhere in the middle there? And this is, again, when you're fittest, when you're running your biggest miles, that type of thing, when you're in, probably the closest time to when the race is. So again, when you're fittest. For us, zone 2 would be tempo, 86% of threshold, that type of 86 to 90%, like that type of what you're looking at, a threshold. And again, for those that use perceived exertion, this is probably the pace you're doing your long runs at, that relative range in there. Again, just check yourself. If you're like, you're looking at that and you're like, no, I'm actually not running quite that fast. Those paces look a little faster than I actually trained at. Then go back and just play with this 5K number. Make it a little slower. Okay, let's try 20:30. Now let's check my paces again. Okay, now zone 1 is more like, it's actually closer to 9 minutes. It's more like 8:40-ish type pace. Okay, now we're talking, this is closer to what I'm at. Once you get those training paces where you feel comfortable with them, then you can look up here and you can kind of look, oh, you know what? I did actually do a half marathon when I was training for this marathon, and I ran, relatively close to 136-ish, or maybe I ran 137, maybe I ran 135. Just, you can kind of check yourself with some of these other race type times. I actually did run a 5K and I ran around 21 minutes or 20:50, that type of thing. And then basically what you do is you get your goal. This is what the calculator, says you can run for your actual goal race, that Bay State Marathon that has 20 feet of elevation gain per mile, that type of thing. It thinks that I can run 3:23, so that's great. Again, and obviously you can do this for any distance. You could do it for a half marathon. Or a 5K. It will be good for any distance. Just make sure you put in as accurate as possible inputs, and that will give you the most accurate output. So there's that 136 half that it thinks I can run. So that essentially is the calculator. Let's just see here. Now, there are some other considerations. Something the calculator does not take into account, weather. You know, there's a big difference between running a marathon or a half marathon in, 70 degrees in humid weather versus a 45-degree day and a crisp, clear day. Heat and humidity will slow you down, just about everybody. The amount of slowing is really dependent on the degree of heat and humidity, so really how hot and humid it is, and also the individual's acclimation to heat. So if that's something you've been training in all this time, you're probably a little bit better prepared than if somebody comes from really cold weather and has to run in the heat, that type of thing. So that's definitely a consideration. Once you get that goal time that the calculator thinks you can run, you may have to adjust as based on weather. Altitude is the same thing. If for some reason you're racing at altitude, it's not taking into account altitude at all. And of course, the other factors that go into actually running, to your capabilities in a race, certainly fueling is a big deal. So make sure your race fueling is on par. The actual pacing or execution of the race is a big deal. So running, the calculator thinks that I can run 3:23 for the marathon. The best way to do that is to even split, meaning running even halves. So basically 141.5 for the first half and 141 for the second half, or negative splitting. So maybe running more like 142 or 143 for the first half and 139 or 140 for the second half. So actual pacing of the race, that's a discussion for another day, but that will very much, as well as fueling and things like that, very much also play into what time you're able to run. Anyway, that is our run calculator. So let me know if you have any questions. You can just get to me at beth@therunformula.com, and we will do our best to help you. Thanks for listening.